big question that Christians often ask, and particularly around this time of the Christian season, Good Friday, is why did Jesus die? And I want to look at 4 other questions that explain why Jesus had to die. And if you can, just kind of enter into what's being said and see how these different people involved in Jesus' death played their part. And the 4 questions are, why did the Roman authorities execute Jesus? The second one is, why did the Jewish authorities hand him over to the Romans to be executed? The third, what do we think Jesus' intention in the whole matter was? And the 4th question, why did the first century predominantly Jewish church and Jewish Christians refer to Jesus' death in such terms as, he loved me and gave himself for me? And as we look at these questions, we will see something that still happens today, that it's impossible to separate theology and politics, that somehow they are bound together. So first of all, why did the Romans execute Jesus? At that time, crucifixion was used to get rid of undesirables and to get rid of them with maximum degradation and maximum humiliation. And it's said to all those that witnessed the crucifixion, loud and clear, we Romans are in charge. This is our land, you're under us. It proclaimed very brutally the absolute sovereignty of Rome and Caesar. And Jesus was executed ultimately as a rebel against Rome. Theology and politics coming together. To most who saw his crucifixion, it would have appeared that Friday afternoon and Friday morning that it was the execution of a failed would-be Messiah. However, Pilate and Jesus' Jewish accusers both knew at heart that Jesus was not a political rebel. Jesus had gone about teaching that God is king. And of course, that would imply that if God was king, Caesar wasn't. And that was a revolutionary statement to make. But it wasn't sufficient enough for the Romans to arrest him and execute him. And it turns out that when we look at Pilate in a bit more detail, we see that he was in fact a weak bully. When the Jewish authorities handed Jesus over to him, he did not want to do what his Jewish subjects wanted him to do. And in a sense, he wanted to snub them. But he was also afraid of Caesar. And if news leaked out, you let this man go, and therefore you're no friend of Caesar. That was the punchline that brought Pilate up short to do what the Jewish authorities wanted. When Pilate washed his hands of Jesus' death, it was an empty, contemptuous symbol, pretending that he could evade responsibility. Pilate's motive was to go against the chief priests, not to rescue Jesus. So the Romans executed Jesus because Pilate put cynical power games before justice and naked self-interest before them both. So what of the Jewish authorities? Why did they hand Jesus over to the Romans? Well, earlier in the week, Jesus had gone into the temple and turned over the tables. You know the story well. And when he did that, he was claiming to be, very clearly, he was claiming to be the Jewish Messiah. And in the same moment, declaring that the temple was now redundant. And the Jewish authorities wanted Jesus out of the way because that they were convinced that Jesus was leading people astray. Jesus was setting aside some of the most cherished symbols of Judaism of his day and replacing them with loyalty to himself. As John recorded earlier in chapter 11, then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. "What are we accomplishing?" they asked. "Here is this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." So you can see the thrust, the strings, if you like, that were pulling the Jewish authorities. And then Luke records at Jesus' trial, they asked Jesus directly, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus said, "You are right in saying I am." And that was the charge of blasphemy. If you remember, they tore their robes, and they then had to convert that blasphemy into something that would cause the Romans to execute Jesus, because the Jews had no authority to execute anybody. So they had to declare Jesus guilty of a political charge, which was punishable by death. And as Luke chapter 23 records, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Christ, a king." Well, Jesus didn't oppose paying taxes, if you remember, but he did claim to be Christ, a king. So what was Jesus' intention? Well, the night before his execution, Jesus celebrated with his disciples what we now call the Last Supper, which was a Passover meal. A meal which looked back to the Exodus when the Jews were freed from slavery to the Egyptians, way, way back in history by that time. And Jesus gave this Passover, that old Exodus, a new meaning. Jesus saw himself symbolizing a new Exodus. That is, that the arrival of God's kingdom through his own fate was about to happen. And we still remember that every time we have communion, when we recall the bread and the body and the wine and the blood. Jesus knew he was going to proclaim that his death was the central and climatic act of God's redemption of Israel. And that act was the forgiveness of sins. And that forgiveness is the true end of exile. The new Exodus from freedom was to be forgiven. And Jesus died ultimately because he believed firmly it was his vocation to do so. What he had been born to do. That his death would announce the end of the present evil age. Also that through his death, Jesus declared the way to the kingdom was the way of peace, the way of love, the way of the cross. The cross clearly shows that God's kingdom would not come about by using the weapons of the enemy. In fact, on the cross, Jesus took it upon himself to lose the battle against the enemy's weapons in the belief that God would vindicate him. And that is how he became the light of the world. And the cross points to how all who follow him should be lights to the world. Jesus' cross defeated evil. And therefore the cross is a symbol of the victory of God. But also a symbol of how we should love others. Finally, why did the first century Jewish Christians refer to Jesus' death in such terms as "he loved me and gave himself for me"? Paul in Ephesians 5 wrote, "Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God." In other words, do what Christ did. Do the things he did. Be the sort of person that he was. Living a life of love. Sacrificially. Christ handed himself over to death for his people. That was a supreme demonstration of his love for them. Paul said that Jesus is to be the model of our love, that costly sacrificial love is to be the distinguishing mark of a Christian's life. To serve others in that way not only pleases God, it is to imitate both God and Christ. To be the light of the world means to follow the way of the man on the cross and to pick up your own cross daily. Jesus' disciples copy Jesus' love and declare his kingdom by the giving of sacrificial love. Amen.